The train arrived in Durango on a Tuesday, which was not the day he had requested. He had written it clearly in the letter. Thursday, the 15th, no earlier, because he needed time to prepare the house, to instruct the staff, to ensure that the first impression she received of the Hale Ranch would be precisely what he intended. He had planned it the way he planned everything, with order, with deliberate care, with the understanding that appearances were not vanity but architecture. She arrived on Tuesday. He was standing at the south fence when his foreman rode up fast with the news, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, just looked out at the ridgeline, where the late October sky had gone the color of old copper, and he thought about the ballroom. The ballroom was the reason for Thursday. He had built it over 18 months, which was longer than most men in Garfield County took to build an entire house. He had brought a craftsman up from Santa Fe to lay the floor, white oak, fitted so precisely that not a single board whispered underfoot. He had ordered the chandeliers from a catalog printed in Philadelphia. He had chosen the wallpaper himself, a pattern of pale gold and ivory that the catalog called Continental Wheat, which he had found slightly ridiculous but had ordered anyway because it suited the room in a way nothing else did. The room was, by any honest measure, magnificent. It was also, by any practical measure, entirely useless. The ranch employed 41 men. It covered 11,000 acres of Colorado rangeland. It ran cattle, kept horses, managed a small orchard, and produced more daily work than most small towns. Nobody at the Hale Ranch had ever danced. Nobody had attended a formal supper with candles and white linen. The ballroom stood at the east end of the main house like a sentence written in a language nobody on the property could read. But he had built it for her, for the woman who would be his wife, because a man in his position did not bring a woman to an empty life. He brought her to something worthy of her consideration. He had imagined the moment with some precision. Thursday evening, a lamp lit in the entrance. Her face when she first stepped through the wide double doors and saw the floor, the chandeliers, the continental wheat walls. He had not imagined Tuesday. He had not imagined the wagon she arrived on, a freight wagon, not the hired coach he had arranged, loaded with things he could not immediately identify from a distance, but which, as it drew closer, revealed themselves to include what appeared to be a cast iron bread oven, 4 wooden crates stacked with cloth-wrapped bundles, and a cage containing 2 chickens. He stood at the front gate of his grand ranch in his best coat, on a Tuesday he had not requested, watching a freight wagon carry a bread oven and live poultry toward his home. The woman driving it did not look like she required his assistance. She brought the wagon to a stop with the calm efficiency of someone who had parked freight wagons in front of grand houses before, which she almost certainly had not, but which she managed with the kind of quiet confidence that made the distinction irrelevant. She set the brake. She climbed down without waiting for anyone to offer a hand. Not because she was making a point, but because the ground was right there and her legs worked perfectly well. She wore a brown traveling dress that had seen genuine travel, a dark wool coat with one button replaced in a slightly different shade, and a hat that was practical rather than decorative. She was young, younger than he had expected, though he was not entirely certain what he had expected. She had dark eyes that moved quickly across the property, taking inventory the way a person does when they are calculating the gap between what they were promised and what they have arrived to find. He walked toward her. He had prepared a greeting. He did not deliver it. "You came early," he said instead. "I came when the freight was ready," she replied, without apology or elaboration. She turned back to the wagon and began assessing how to remove the first crate. "The coach schedule adds 3 days. I don't have 3 days to give to a schedule." He stood beside her for a moment, caught between the greeting he had prepared and the situation that had replaced it. "The coach was arranged," he said. "I arranged something better." She pulled the first crate to the edge of the wagon bed and looked at him with the direct, assessing gaze of someone deciding how useful he might be. Are your men around? I'll need help with the oven. He sent for 2 ranch hands. He did not help with the oven himself, which he would later identify as the first mistake of their marriage, though at the time it felt like dignity. The bread oven was carried up the front steps by 2 men who had expected, when they woke that Tuesday morning, to spend the day checking fence line. They managed it without complaint, primarily because she thanked them with the specific gravity of someone who understood physical labor and respected it. He noticed that. Noticed too that she spoke to them differently than she spoke to him. More warmly, more directly, with none of the careful assessment she reserved for conversations with him. She was deciding something about him. He had the uncomfortable awareness of being evaluated rather than welcomed. The chickens were carried around to the back without commentary. Inside, she moved through the house with her quick cataloging eyes. The parlor, the kitchen, the corridor. And when she reached the end of the hall and he opened the double doors to the ballroom, he felt something he had not anticipated feeling in this moment: nervous. The room was exactly as he had arranged it. The chandeliers, the floor, the pale gold of the continental wheat walls in the afternoon light. She stood in the doorway and was quiet for a long moment. He waited. That was the strange part. Nathan Hale, who had never in his adult life waited for anyone's verdict on anything he owned, stood in the doorway of his own ballroom and waited for a woman who had arrived on a train 3 hours ago to tell him what she thought of it. She walked in slowly. Not with wonder, exactly, with attention. The same attention she had given the kitchen and the corridor and the men carrying her bread oven, the attention of someone who was already measuring. She crossed to the center of the floor and looked up at the chandeliers. 3 of them, each imported at considerable expense from a supplier in Chicago, each fitted with enough candles to illuminate a moderate-sized ballroom, or, as it happened, an immoderate-sized one. The afternoon light came through the high windows on the western wall in long, pale columns. The room smelled of beeswax and cedar, and the particular clean emptiness of a space that had never been used. She turned once, slowly, taking in the full circumference of the walls. Then she turned back toward him, and there was something in her expression he could not quite name. Not disapproval, not admiration either. It was the expression of someone doing arithmetic. "How many people have danced here?" she asked. "It is new," he said. "When was it built?" "Completed last October. And before that?" He looked at her directly. "There was no room before that. I had it built." "For what occasion?" He kept his voice even. "For this one." She looked at him then with something closer to understanding, which was somehow worse than judgment, because understanding implied she was already several steps ahead of him. She glanced back at the room, the floor, the chandeliers, the length of it, which could have seated 30 at long tables, or held 60 people moving through a proper reel, or, as was becoming increasingly clear to him, held considerably more if the furniture were different. "It's a beautiful room," she said. He felt the relief begin, and then she continued. "It's also the largest single enclosed space on this property that isn't being used for anything." The relief departed. She walked toward the western windows and looked out at the land. From this angle, she would be seeing the eastern pasture, dry and gold in the autumn sun, and beyond it the ridge that marked the beginning of his upper grazing land. He knew, because he had stood at those windows himself and thought about what the view would mean to someone seeing it for the first time. He was not certain she was seeing the view at all. "What is your average capacity at the main table?" she asked, not turning around. "For dinner? 12, comfortably." "And your ranch hands, they eat separately." She turned from the window. "I see," she said. Those 2 words carried the particular weight of someone who had arrived at a conclusion that the other party had not yet begun to suspect. She looked around the room one more time, and her expression had shifted. It was not disapproval. It was possibility. She did not explain herself that evening. He had half expected her to. A woman who moved through a room the way she did measuring it with her eyes rather than her admiration. Seemed like a woman who would state her intentions plainly, but she said nothing more about capacity or ranch hands or enclosed space. She sat at the small dinner table, asked him two careful questions about the autumn weather in that particular valley, listened to his answers with the focused attention of someone taking notes in her head, and thanked him for the meal with a courtesy that was entirely genuine and entirely unrevealing. He told himself he was not curious. He was almost convincing. The next morning he was down at the far paddock before sunrise, which was his habit, checking on the fencing along the eastern boundary, where the posts had been soft all summer. He returned to the house at 7:30 and found that the kitchen had been reorganized, not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself. But the pantry door was open, and the shelves had been rearranged according to a logic he could not immediately identify, and the cast iron pans were hanging in a different order along the wall. And there was a list on the kitchen table written in a precise, unhurried hand. He picked it up. It was an inventory: flour, salt, lard, molasses, dried beans, cornmeal. Quantities, estimated weights, the number of days each would last at current usage. At the bottom of the list, underlined once, were two words: projected shortfall. He set the paper down carefully, as though it might say something further if he left it undisturbed. She came in from the back porch, carrying an armful of firewood that she had clearly split herself, because the axe was still in her hand. She did not appear surprised to find him standing there. She set the wood down by the stove, returned the axe to its hook by the door, and said, "Your cook has been rationing incorrectly. He's stretching the flour by cutting the cornmeal, but cornmeal runs lower. You'll be short before the first snow." He looked at the list again. "You determined this since yesterday evening?" "Since this morning," she said, "though I had my suspicions yesterday when I saw the bread." He was quiet for a moment. What kind of suspicions does bread produce? "The kind that come from watching someone try to make a little look like enough," she said simply. "It's a particular texture. Anyone who's done it themselves would know it." She went to the stove and began building up the fire with the efficiency of someone who had been doing it since she was old enough to hold a match. He watched her and said nothing. There was something in the way she moved through a room, any room, that suggested she had already accounted for every object in it and decided exactly what each one was worth. Not in money, in use. He thought about the ballroom. He thought about what she had said about enclosed space. He thought about the word projected. He did not leave when the fire caught. That was the first thing she noticed. Men who came to inspect something usually left once they had seen enough. He stayed by the doorway with his arms crossed, and that careful measuring expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of genuine interest, though he would have denied it. She set the kettle on and turned to the shelf where she had reorganized his cook's supplies the night before, not by category but by urgency. What would run out first stood nearest the door. What would last through winter sat at the back. "Your cook," she said without turning, "is not a bad man. He's making the best of what he was given. But he was given poor instructions and no inventory, and that combination produces exactly the kind of waste that looks like enough until it suddenly isn't. He's been cooking for this outfit for 6 years. Then he's been underprovided for 6 years and managed it on loyalty alone." She pulled a tin from the shelf and opened it. The flour inside had the faintly gray look of something stretched. "This is 3 parts flour to 1 part dried cornmeal dust. It bakes fine, it fools the eye, but it doesn't fool the stomach past the first hour of work, and your men are doing 12-hour days." He was quiet. "Then, how do you know what 12-hour days feel like?" She put the tin down and looked at him directly. "Because I have worked them." He didn't ask more. She hadn't expected him to. She turned back to the stove, and the silence between them settled into something that was not uncomfortable, which surprised her more than any word he might have spoken. She had expected the ranch to feel like a negotiation, An ongoing, exhausting negotiation between what she was willing to give and what would be taken regardless. She had come with her terms memorized the way some women memorize scripture. She had come ready. What she had not prepared for was this particular quality of quiet, the kind that didn't press. He moved from the doorway and came to stand near the table, not close, but no longer at a distance that said, "I am only passing through." He looked at her reorganized shelf with something she might have called respect, if she had been willing to call it anything yet. "The ballroom," he said at last. "Yes, you said it could be made useful. I said it was already useful. I simply changed what it was useful for." He picked up the list she had written and read it again, slowly this time, as if he were reading something other than flour counts and cornmeal ratios, as if the list itself were a kind of argument he was only now beginning to follow. "What else do you need?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. It was the first time he had asked what she needed rather than what she intended. She chose her next words with the same care she had chosen everything else since the moment she stepped off that train. She set down the cloth she had been folding and told him. Not everything, not yet, but enough that a man paying genuine attention would understand the scale of what she was proposing. More flour by the barrel rather than the sack. A second iron pot, the large kind, the kind that could hold enough stew to warm 30 men on a bitter night. Dried beans in quantity. Salt pork in enough supply that they would not be sending riders into town every second week. 2 more long tables, plain ones, built for work rather than appearance. A second set of shelves along the far wall of the ballroom, the one that caught the morning light. He listened without interrupting. That, too, was new. When she finished, he did not argue the cost. He did not say, "That seems excessive," or, "I'll consider what's reasonable." He said, "The tables can be built by end of week. The rest I can send for." He paused. "The shelves may take longer." "The shelves can wait," she said. "The provisions cannot." He nodded once, as if an agreement had been reached between two parties of equal standing, and she felt something shift in the room. Not dramatically. Not in the way stories describe a great turning point with violins and golden light. It was quieter than that. The kind of shift that happens when a man stops measuring a woman against his expectations and begins simply looking at what is actually in front of him. He moved toward the door, then stopped. His hand rested on the frame. Outside, she could hear 2 of the ranch hands crossing the yard, their boots crunching on frost-hardened ground. "There are men who will say the ballroom is ruined," he said. His voice was careful, not apologetic, but careful. "There are men who will say a great many things," she replied. He turned to look at her then. Not quickly. The way a man looks when he wants to understand something rather than simply react to it. She held his gaze without softness and without defiance. Simply held it. "And you," he said. "What do you say?" She thought for a moment before answering, because she was not the kind of woman who spoke before she knew what she meant. "I say that a beautiful room that cannot sustain the people who live in it is not a beautiful room. It is an ornament, and ornaments do not survive hard winters." She paused. "Neither do ranches that confuse beauty with strength." Something moved across his face. She did not have a name for it yet. He left without another word, but not in the way he had left before, in the first days when his silence had carried the cold weight of disapproval. This silence was different. It had texture to it. The quality of a man turning an idea over in his mind, pressing on it gently, testing whether it held. She turned back to her work, but her hands moved a little more steadily than they had before. Outside, the sky was beginning to cloud from the northwest. The clouds from the northwest did not politely announce themselves. They arrived the way trouble always does on the high plains. Quietly at first, then all at once, with a purpose that left no room for argument. By evening, the temperature had dropped 12 degrees. By morning, it had dropped 12 more. She was already awake when the first ranch hand knocked on the kitchen door before dawn, his face rigid with cold. his collar turned up against a wind that had teeth in it. He did not say much. He did not need to. She could read weather in a man's posture the same way she had learned to read it in the sky. She waved him inside, put coffee on before he had removed his hat, and began pulling flour sacks from the shelf with the calm efficiency of someone who had been planning for this moment longer than he knew. She had been planning for it since the second week. The ballroom kitchen, she had stopped thinking of it by any other name, had been arranged not only for summer feeding but for exactly this kind of emergency. The dry goods were stacked deep. The ovens were positioned to hold heat longest when the outer walls began to lose it. The tables she had hauled in with such determination were wide enough to serve 20 men standing, eating quickly, needing to return to work before their hands stiffened. By the time the second hand arrived, and then the third, she had bread already in the oven, and a pot of something thick and salted beginning to move on the iron range. She did not ask what was happening with the cattle. She did not need to ask. She could hear it in the way the men spoke to each other. Short sentences, no wasted words, the particular shorthand of people managing something large and frightening together. She simply fed them. She kept the coffee strong and the bread coming and the room warm, which mattered more than any of them said aloud. He came through around mid-morning. He did not look like a man who had slept. He looked like a man who had been out in the dark doing the mathematics of disaster and had not yet finished calculation. He stopped when he saw the room, the full tables, the hands moving in and out, the warmth that hit against the cold air every time the door opened. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She handed him a cup of coffee without ceremony, without comment, without any expression that asked to be noticed or thanked. It was simply the right thing to do, and she did it, and he took it. He wrapped both hands around the cup. Outside, the wind had begun to build against the western wall of the house, pressing in long, slow pulses, the kind that tested foundations and found the places where the mortar had grown thin. Inside, the bread was rising in the warmth. She went back to her work, and he stayed longer than she expected. He did not leave when the others did. That was the thing she noticed first. The hands rotated in and out as the morning deepened. Men coming in from the cold, warming themselves, eating, pulling on their coats and going back out to whatever the storm demanded of them. There was a rhythm to it, functional and unglamorous, the way any real work has its own tempo that has nothing to do with grace. But he stayed. He moved to the side of the room where the wall met the window, where a man could stand without being in the way, and he watched the operation she had built, with the same careful attention he might have given to a contract he did not yet fully understand. She did not perform for him. She had learned early that performing was a kind of surrender, a signal that a woman's actions required an audience to have meaning. Her actions had meaning with or without his gaze, and she intended to keep it that way. But she was not unaware of him. He refilled his own cup, which she thought was notable. A man of his standing did not often reach for his own coffee. He asked one of the younger hands a question she could not hear over the noise of the room, and whatever the answer was, it made him look toward the bread racks with something close to calculation, not suspicion, something more honest than that. The wind pressed harder against the western wall. Someone reported that the temperature had dropped another 4 degrees since dawn. The number traveled through the room in low voices, the way bad news always does, not loudly, because loudness would make it more real than anyone wanted it to be. She began planning the noon meal before the breakfast dishes were cleared. That was how it worked now. The kitchen did not rest between moments. It moved forward and she moved with it, because the ranch required continuity, not pause. He came closer around mid-morning. Not intrusively, he stood at a reasonable distance, watching her assess the remaining stores. The sacks of flour stacked along the east wall, the dried provisions she had organized in the weeks before the storm arrived, the things she had quietly doubled when the sky had told her in September what November intended to bring. He said quietly, so that only she could hear, "You were ready for this." It was not a question. It was not quite a compliment. It was the careful statement of a man who was revising a previous conclusion and had the integrity to admit it without ceremony. She did not stop what she was doing. She moved 2 sacks of flour from the second row to the first, assessed the weight of a tin of lard, and only then looked at him. Someone had to busy, she said. It was not unkind. It was simply honest, in the way that the West respects honest things, without decoration, without apology, and without any softening of the truth that both of them already knew. He nodded once, and he stayed. He stayed. That was the thing the ranch hands noticed first. Not that he had entered the hall. He had done that before, stiffly, out of obligation or inspection, but that he stayed without apparent purpose, without a ledger under his arm, without the posture of a man performing supervision. He simply remained in the room, and the room seemed to accept him differently because of it. She gave him no instruction and asked him for nothing. That was not indifference. That was a form of respect she had learned to offer carefully, having observed that proud men, when offered help they have not requested, often refuse it out of instinct rather than genuine unwillingness. So she allowed him to find his own way into the work. She continued moving through the hall with her quiet authority, and he watched, and eventually he picked up a crate that needed repositioning and moved it without being asked. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. The storm pressed on through the afternoon with patient, merciless intention. The wind found every gap in the outer walls of the estate and reminded the structure of its own impermanence. But the hall held warmth. The ovens she had installed in September, the ones he had once looked at as evidence of poor taste and poorer judgment, burned with steady, generous heat that reached every corner of the room. The men came in from the drifts with ice in their collars and feeling gone from their hands, and the hall received them the way a hall should receive men who have worked honestly in brutal cold, with warmth and with food, and with the quiet dignity of a space that takes them seriously. She moved among them without ceremony, assessing what each man needed before he had finished forming the request. A cup of something hot, a place to sit near the heat, a word that acknowledged what the morning had cost them. She offered all of these things with an efficiency so natural it looked effortless, though he had begun to understand, standing in that room, that nothing she did was effortless. Everything was the product of attention paid in advance. He found himself thinking of the letter that had arrived with her name on it, months ago, the brief lines she had written about herself, practical, experienced, unafraid of hard work. He had read those words and formed an image that bore very little resemblance to the woman in front of him. He had been reading for information, he realized. He had not been reading for truth. There was a difference. He was only now beginning to understand how large a difference it was. Outside, the storm showed no sign of relenting. The afternoon light, what little existed behind the wall of cloud and driven snow, began to fail. Earlier than it should have, she noticed. He saw her notice, and she adjusted, as she always did, before the adjustment became a crisis. The lamps she lit were not decorative. She had arranged them deliberately weeks before, positioned at intervals she had calculated not for ambiance, but for utility, so that no corner of the room fell into shadow when the outside world abandoned them to darkness. He had noticed the placement at the time and said nothing, assuming it was some personal preference, some habit carried from whatever life she had led before arriving at his door. He understood now that it was forethought, that it had always been forethought. The temperature in the room held. Outside, the cattle losses continued. He knew it without going to check. A man learned, in years enough on the range, to read the silence of a storm. This one was not finished with them. It still had intentions. She brought the hands in from the outer barn in 2 rotations, those who had been working the farthest posts first, those nearest last. She did not ask him whether this was the right order. She did not ask him anything. She had already gathered the information she needed: distances, conditions, who had been out the longest, and she had acted on it before the question of acting could even form in his mind. He watched this happen and felt something he could not immediately name. Not embarrassment, precisely. Something closer to vertigo. The sensation of discovering that the ground beneath you has been sloping gently all along, and you had only now noticed the tilt. One of the older hands, a man who had been on the ranch longer than most, and who had greeted her arrival with barely concealed skepticism, sat down at the long table without being invited and reached for the bread without ceremony. It was the gesture of a man at home. She set a bowl in front of him without comment, without any expression that suggested she had go through the shift. But the older hand looked up at her once, briefly, with something that might have been acknowledgement, and she gave the slightest nod in return. He almost missed it. He was glad he did not. The evening deepened. The storm did not. It pressed against the windows with a constancy that had moved beyond violence into something almost meditative, a long, unbroken pressure, white and cold and absolute. Inside the room, the heat was reliable, the food was reliable, the voices were low, tired in the way that honest labor produces, not broken but worn clean. He helped her clear, eventually, without announcing that he was going to. He simply began, as she had done on so many evenings before him, without ceremony, without requiring that anyone take note of the decision. She did not comment. She handed him a stack of bowls and moved past him to tend the fire. And for a moment, they worked side by side in the way that people do when they have stopped performing for each other. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. The storm broke some time before dawn, though neither of them was awake to witness the exact moment. What they found in the morning was a world reshaped, the yard buried to the fence posts, the outbuildings half swallowed, the sky scrubbed to a pale and tentative blue that looked almost apologetic for what it had permitted the night before. She was up before the light had fully committed to itself. She had been up, he suspected, before he had finished deciding to rise. By the time he came through the hall, the room was already warm, the smell of coffee already certain, and the long tables already set for a meal that the men outside would need as soon as they could reach the door. He stood in the entrance for a moment. He told himself he was assessing the damage visible through the east window. He was not. What he was doing was watching her move through the room she had made. The room he had built for a different purpose, for a different vision of what his life was supposed to look like. And understanding, perhaps for the first time without resistance, that she had not diminished it. She had completed it. A ballroom required an audience, a performance, an occasion that justified its own grandeur. What she had built required nothing so fragile. It sustained itself. It sustained everyone inside it. The first of the hands came in stamping snow from their boots, and she was ready. She did not fuss. She did not praise them for arriving. She handed them warmth in the form of a bowl and a cup, and the particular dignity of not being asked to explain their need for it. He found himself among them, not as the man who owned the land, not as the authority who had been waited upon and consulted and deferred to across two difficult seasons, simply as one of the people in the room who was cold and had come inside. She set a cup in front of him without ceremony, and moved on to the next man without making anything of it, and he sat with the cup in his hands and looked at the walls of the room he had designed with such deliberate pride. The high windows, the clean lines, the proportions he had argued about with the builder for the better part of a spring, and felt something in him settle. He had built this room to be admired. She had made it necessary. There was a difference between those two things that he had not understood until this moment, sitting at a long table among men who were alive and warm and fed, because she had decided that surviving was a collective matter and that elegance, genuine elegance, was what happened when no one in your care went without. He did not say anything, neither did she. But when she passed behind him a second time, her hand rested briefly on the back of his chair. Not on his shoulder, not quite, and she did not slow for step, and he did not turn. He did not need to. The winter broke slowly, the way hard things often do, not in a single dramatic morning, but in small surrenders. A softer line of light along the ridge, water running again beneath ice that had seemed permanent, the smell of something loosening in the earth that had been locked for months. She noticed all of it. She was not a woman who waited for the world to announce itself. She watched it instead, the way she watched everything, quietly, without theater, with the kind of attention that looks like patience, but is actually something closer to intelligence at rest. He noticed her noticing. He had spent a great deal of that winter watching her without her knowledge, or so he believed. He watched the way she moved through the room she had claimed, efficient and unhurried at once. He watched the way the men looked at her, not with desire, but with something rarer, something that took longer to earn, trust. The particular trust of people who have been fed and warmed, and not once made to feel that your trouble was an inconvenience to anyone of consequence. He understood by February that he had confused admiration for weakness when she arrived. He understood by March that he had confused his own pride for a welcome. He did not say any of this aloud. He was not yet a man who could say such things without rehearsal. But one evening in early April, when the hands had gone out and the room was quiet, and she was clearing the last of the long tables by lamplight, he came back through the door he had already left through and stood in the entrance of the room that had once been his grand ballroom. And he said, plainly, that she had been right. She set down what was in her hands. She looked at him. He said it had not been easy to see. He said he imagined it had not been easy to wait for. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that she had not been waiting for him to see it. She had simply been doing what needed doing, whether he understood it was his own matter, not hers. He nodded. He had expected that answer. He had almost hoped for it. He asked if she intended to stay. She looked at the room, the high windows he had argued over, the walls that had held warmth and noise, and the kind of life that could not be designed by any architect, only arrived at through necessity and care. Then she looked at him with the steady gaze of a woman who had built something real in a place that had tried to reduce her to decoration. She said that depended entirely on whether he was asking her to stay as his wife or as the woman who ran his kitchen. He said he was asking her to stay as the person who had taught him the difference between a room that was admired and a room that was necessary, and that he hoped those two things might finally, after everything, be the same. She picked up what she had set down. She did not say yes immediately, but she smiled, and she did not hide it, and the lamp burned warm between them in the room that had become, against all expectation, the heart of everything.